And many studies have also found that literacy practices or literacy teaching actually helps them to develop this new language and new culture, because literacy events or literacy practices helps them to connect their own cultural heritage and cultural language and home language to the new ones, which is English. And many studies also found that these children's interactions with literacy are often developed in faith setting, like religious-based school or places of worship, depending on what religions they are attached to. But unfortunately, we don't know much about the literacy teaching or literacy practices in Islamic school. So this is very important. Why Islamic school? Because first, there is the students in this setting are underrepresented in the research. That's the first reason. And the second reason is that this is my personal subject on self-understanding, self-representations, and controversies surrounding the concept of Islam. And then those concepts were translated into some types of classroom activities and her role as the teacher, which was the teaching was divided into 2 blocks, the 40 minutes each. So for classroom activities, usually the teacher did read a lot in the first block, like 40 minutes. And then for the second block, it was a combination between any of these activities. For example, maybe silent reading or presentations, or maybe real and practice or integrated editing. So that's the combinations of these activities for the second block. And her role for the teachers, my data shows that the teacher plays a role as a classroom norms manager, because from her talk here, she shows that the students to give directions, and then she models of a good reader, she reminds the ground rules of discussion, and she set up the classroom expectations. And this category here leads me to the understanding that her role as a classroom norms manager. And the second role is the teacher as discussion leader, and it was based on the data of questions that she asked. She asked, for example, engaging questions or questions that initiate the conversations of the students. For example, here her talk is, can someone remind me what happened in chapter 10, and so on and so on. So that leads me to the classifications of discussion leader, or teacher as discussion leader. Now, research findings number 2, what texts are available? There are 3 types of text: print books, digital text, and teacher-made worksheets. From print books, her decisions of what books to be used in the class was based on the recommendations made by the state standard here, and then the curriculum here, and then her teaching experience and preference of books that she used. So these 7 books here are the books that are supposed to be finished during one school year. But only the first 3 books, But Not Body, Out of the Dust, and Blood on the River, that I had a chance to observe. This is the book's cover. And the second type of text is digital text. So everyone in the class got an iPad, and usually this is the extensions of reading. For example, when they read But Not Body, they talk about discriminations, racism, segregations during the Great Depressions, which back in the 30s, And then the teacher assigned them to find more information in the internet about what is going on today related to this issue. What does Islam say about this issue? So there is these combinations of Islam view and secular view, which is found in the internet related to the issues. And that's when they use digital text, with combinations between articles from the internet and also what is said in the Quran or the Hadith, which is the sacred text of the Islam. And the third types of text is teacher-made worksheets. This is also the supplementary materials. For example, when they learn literary text about figurative language, then the teacher provided this poem or informational text made by the teacher herself to learn, more about comprehensions. And now research questions 3, what is the student response to teacher-led discussion? The topic of discussions, I found that mostly this one. And then the pattern of discussion though, it was either the IRE or initiate, respond, and evaluate, or dialogic. So let's focus on these patterns of discussion to see what is the student response. IRE here, my data, this is the exchange of conversations going on in the class. And then from this conversation, we can see that the teacher initiate the conversations, and then the student respond, and then teacher again evaluate. And this pattern is repeated through all the conversations. IRE, IRE, and IRE. And student response to these patterns of discussion was short, as you may see here. And then the flow of the conversation was directed to the teacher, and the teacher helped because why it was directed to the teacher? Because the teacher has this control of the turn taking. So she decides who speak next and when. And then the teacher also held the interpretive authority. She decided what is wrong or right according to the response of the teacher and the students. And then the next patterns of discussion is dialogic. As you may see here, the flow of the conversation is no longer IRE. So sometimes they go to let the students talk more over each other, and then the flow of the conversation is directed over each other, of course. And then the next part of the question is students respond to the teacher created assignment. Some of them express that sometimes they fail to follow the instructions or directions because of misunderstanding of what should they be doing in the classroom. And some of them express that they are distracted when working in small group because some of students just talk off topic when discussing or work in a small group. But they all agree that talk or discussions about text may enhance the comprehensions. They just need this constant reminder to stay focused on the lessons. So based on those findings, my study extends the discussions of the literature in these three big themes. The first is reading is carried out as a social practice. As you may already know that I already mentioned that the literacy events were not situated within an individual mind or a person's or a student working by himself to process text, but the literacy events were situated in the interactions or the social interactions between two or more people, and that's the social context that reading is a social practice or situated social practice. And then the second discussion is that the students' learning of the new culture is mediated through text. They read about But Not Buddy, which tells a story about Great Depressions in the 30s. And then they read Out of the Dust, which tells a story about Dust Bowl, also back in the 30s. And then they read Blood on the River, which tells a story about earlier European colonialism towards or against the Native Americans, and also back in the history of America. So they learn about the socio-historical context of the US, a society where they live now. And then it also extends the concepts of learning according to the socio-cultural theory, which was defined by Vygotsky, Luria, or Rex, who says that learning is actually a mediated action to develop human mental functioning through the mediational means. The mediational means is either language or text, or can be both. Another important discussion in here is the reading of sacred text. It is extended to the sacred text. So they use the sacred text, which is the Quran and the Hadith, as a lens to filter a knowledge that they gain from the sacred text. So Islamic values and knowledge here were used to justify what is wrong and right according to Islam, and then what is appropriate and accepted in the socio-cultural context of the society, which is US society. So that is when Zine in Canada said that Islamic school actually create a counterculture, a culture which is different from the US community at large, but it is an intersection between what it means to be an American and at the same time what it means to be a Muslim. So based on that discussions, I illustrate this hypothetical model to illustrate how the teacher mediates the literacy learning of the students that lead to the knowledge and identity constructions as the results of learning. And it starts from the epistemology that come from two different views. The first is reading as social practice, and the second is Islamic knowledge and values. And they come, interwoven together, which then mediated by different languages and different texts. They use English as a language of instructions, and then they learn Arabic at the same time to have to be able to read the Quran and the Hadith. And of course, they have their own home languages, and sacred text and secular text both mixed together. That was translated into some classroom practices and interactions, which was discussions and assignment. And that's how knowledge and identity is constructed, or how the teaching is mediated by the teacher. Now, some limitations of this study is that I only focus on one classroom, and in that particular context, so the result may not be generalizable, or is not generalizable at all.
Thank you.
To the other context. And I didn't collect the data from other school personnels, like the principals or administrators and parents, which I think are important for future research, to have this complex or comprehensive model of literacy teaching in school, which include the entire school entity. And I didn't collect data from student literacy practices outside of the classroom. So I just focused on that particular classroom inside of the classroom. So some recommendations I made for EL teachers, that we need to carefully interpret the state standards into specific learning objectives and activities, and that we need to teach literacy in integrated way, that use language in an interactive way. For example, the use of classroom discussion. And then for future researchers, we need more research to investigate the model of literacy teaching in a classroom context, especially that use of literacy outcomes as a construct or a quantitative measure of the outcomes of the learning, because I didn't measure the outcomes of learning, right? And then for stakeholders, of course, the state and federal government should include this religious-based school in their policy, because these schools, including the Islamic ones, provide an alternative for the US community to send their students or children to school besides the public school. So this is an alternative. And of course, we need teacher professional development for this particular context. What next? So after getting the degree, finger crossed, I will be going back to Indonesia and teaching again in my university. So basically, I'm on leave now. And I would like to study more for my future research about the literacy teaching and learning in Indonesian context, given the fact that in Indonesia, Islam is the majority in the society, and that English is treated as a foreign language. So that might give a different context and explanations of what literacy teaching might look like. So these questions I want to focus on: how literacy teaching is carried out, and then how meaning is constructed, and what sociological and psychological factors influence the teaching of literacy, particularly in Indonesia. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's great for me. Thank you very much. We have about 7 or 8 minutes before we need to